the name. Okay, thanks. So I have to confess that Julius Merzel is actually a Chicago artist, but there are some Indiana connections that'll pop up here and there throughout the talk. And then as I was scrambling to put this together, a book I really needed to work on it arrived via interlibrary loan yesterday. So it's not incorporated here. So we'll wing it a little bit. All right, so I'm calling this talk Julius Merzel, Morbid and Grim, a German artist looks for fame in America. So Merzel in Germany, of course, that was an umlauted O. He anglicized it when he got here. And so I'll probably refer to him mostly as Julius Merzel, which is what people knew him as when he moved to the United States. So in 2017, while leading a language study program in Tübingen, Germany, I took a group of students to nearby Babenhausen Monastery. Let me see if I can get this to click over. Yeah.
We have to click on.
Okay. Just enter, maybe.
I don't want to scroll.
There we go. All right. Whoops. There we go. Okay. So in 2017, while leading a language study program in Tübingen, Germany, I took a group of students to nearby Babenhausen Monastery and Castle. As we were checking in for our tour, the docent was excited to learn that from me that our group was particularly interested in the murals by Julius Merzel that decorate the walls of the Grüner Saal, one of the dining rooms of the castle. She was herself a fan of Merzel's work and was surprised that this group of Americans had any idea who he was. She gave us VIP treatment during the tour and took pains to highlight the Merzel murals. Cut to the same scene. A year later, I'm back in Tübingen with a different group of students. We're visiting Babenhausen, and I again mentioned to our docent, a different woman this time, that we were interested in Merzel. She was completely unimpressed. With a flick of her hand, she says, yeah, Merzel's gar nicht so wichtig, right? So Merzel's not at all important, she said. That little flick of the hand actually kind of ruined the tour for me, but I do know my students enjoyed it nonetheless. And really, I shouldn't have been surprised because I did know that back in 2005, her opinion was shared by at least one fellow Hoosier. It was in December of that year that the Michigan City Public Library was in the process of selling off its art collection to fund some projects. And only then did they realize that 4 paintings in their inventory by Merzel were completely missing, and no one had any idea of when they went away and how they disappeared. But it was no great loss, according to the library director, Don Glossinger. I didn't care for Merzel, he told a reporter. I didn't think he was that great, and his paintings weren't worth much. Glossinger didn't even file a police report for the lost paintings. Doesn't make much sense to report them when we don't know when they came up missing, he said. They aren't even worth the $5,000 insurance deductible. And just to make sure we know how he really felt about Merzel, he added, it's a mystery why anyone would want them. They're not coveted. If there's an art thief in Northwest Indiana, he's not very bright. So, art appreciation is for sure a Geschmacksfrage, right? And the Babenhausen docent and the Michigan City Library director are entitled to their opinions about Merzel's work. And in fact, theirs is likely the majority opinion today since Merzel is hardly a household name. How many here has ever heard of Merzel? Yeah, that's what I would think, right? So he's largely forgotten today, and yet he was in his lifetime an objectively and especially successful artist. He was deeply admired in both his native Germany and in his adopted home in the United States. Today, his work is seen and appreciated by literally hundreds of thousands of people each year, just in Stuttgart and Chicago alone. But almost no one who sees his work would know the name of the artist that produced it. So what happened to Merzel's fame and his reputation? So Merzel was born in Fürth in Bavaria in 1871. His father was a book handler, but Julius pursued his professional education first at the School of Applied Arts in Nuremberg, and then in 1890 at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich. In 1892, he co-founded a company that he described as a Malergeschäft und Werkstätte für dekorative Kunst. So a painter shop and a workshop for decorative arts. And so the decorative arts in that era were embellishing buildings, architectural spaces. He was the lead decorative artist for this firm until 1910 and began to make a name for himself with commissioned decorative work in the Bavarian National Museum and the Künstlerhaus in Munich in 1898 and 1890, both with architect Gabriel Seidel. See if we can see a little bit here. Yeah. His work on these two Prachtbauten won him some public attention and led to work with another prominent architect named Max Littmann. And in 1901, Littmann tapped Merzel to provide wall and ceiling decorations for the Prinzregententheater in Munich, which won Merzel even more acclaim and led to further work with Littmann and his firm. They collaborated on a number of other projects between sort of the turn of the century and the outbreak of World War I. For example, they did the Kurtheater in Bad Kissingen, where Merzel executed, you can just see it in there, a kind of a crane motif on the ceiling of that building. They did the Schiller Theater in Charlottenburg in Berlin, and this work was destroyed during World War II. They did the Großherzogliches Hoftheater in Weimar. Today we know of this, of course, as the Deutsches Nationaltheater. Probably if you've been to Weimar, you've seen that for sure. It also was destroyed in World War II. The facade was retained and it was rebuilt. They did the Künstlertheater in Munich, also destroyed in World War II. Are we sensing a theme here, right? They did the Regentenbau in Bad Kissingen, which is retained today. You can see the ceiling decorative work that Merzel did there. And then they did the Hoftheater. At that time, the Hoftheater in Stuttgart, today, of course, the Staatstheater. And this still survives today. And I want to linger on this just for a minute to give you a sense of the kind of work that Merzel did. So he was commissioned to do the ceiling of the Zuschauerraum, the Großes Haus for the theater, the main part of the theater, right? Because it's a collection of theaters there. Sorry, I lost my place here. So he designed a Sternbilder Himmel, a night sky filled with constellations, as if the audience were sitting in an ancient Greek or Roman theater. And you can get a better sense of it right here. It's spectacular work. He not only designed the ceiling, he also painted it himself. One anecdote from the time describes Merzel lying on his back atop the scaffolding, a paintbrush in one hand and a cigar in the other, kind of reminiscent of Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel, minus the cigar, I assume, right? So this is his masterpiece. It's really the best work of his that is retained today. You know, we talk a lot of people know the famous Marc Chagall ceiling of the Paris Opera, which is fantastic. I'll put Merzel's work right next to it. I think it holds its own against this masterpiece in Paris by Marc Chagall that we see there on the left. So it was restoration of this Deckengemälde in Stuttgart in the early 1980s that kind of led to a rediscovery of Merzel in Germany. And the art historian Judith Breuer has led her to start doing a lot of research and looking for forgotten works by Merzel in buildings around Germany. And to date, she's uncovered 48 that I know of. She may have found more in the meantime that I haven't heard about. There's probably more to be discovered, things that have been painted over time and they can restore them and so forth. So it must have been this work in Stuttgart that caught the eye of Wilhelm II, the last king of Württemberg and the last monarch actually to abdicate after the end of World War I. So Stuttgart was, of course, the Residenzstadt for the Württemberg monarchy. And of course, the king had other lodgings and residences. And one of those was his hunting lodge, his Jagdschloss, which is part of the Bebenhausen Monastery complex. And so this brings us back to the beginning of my presentation, back to the mural work that the monarch himself commissioned Mersel to do at the Jagdschloss in 1916. So I can show you a little bit what we went to see. So the young woman on the left, she was the Mersel fan, right? So we liked her. And then the one in the bottom right, she dismissed him. So we weren't so keen on her. But you can see us, you can see on the back, in the background, this is in the Grünersaal. He has some works kind of elsewhere, but that's the biggest concentration. And you can see what he's been asked by the king to do. He's showing all the little villages and towns and cities and so forth that are part of the kingdom. So I think in the one we can see Babenhausen itself. We see Tübingen, for example, in there. There's another one with Stuttgart. The other one on the lower left is kind of the Wappen and so forth, the Stammbaum, or the family tree, I guess we would call it, all in these sorts of decorative elements that Mersel was known to do. Whoops, back up. How do I get this to back up? Hang on a sec. There we go. He loved to paint kind of fanciful birds and animals and things like this, and this will become a theme for him once he moves to Chicago as well. So these are just some quick examples of Mersel's work. Sorry. Technology. All right. So he did a lot more work in Germany. He did a couple of projects outside of Germany that we know of, including in Rome, one in the Czech Republic. But I'm going to, in the interest of time, kind of skip over that. We need to get him to the United States. So following World War I, the economic situation in Germany, the loss of royal and patrician patronage, and the changing artistic tastes of the time all led to a decline in demand for the kind of decorative work that Mersel specialized in. He decided to seek new opportunities in the United States, and in 1926, he made his way to Chicago. This is him, not too long after that time. In an interview with the Chicago Abendpost, just a few days after his arrival, Mersel said, "The reason I have left my country is because of the improbability of a return of prosperity there for a very long time." But why Chicago rather than, say, New York? Art historian Jill Forrest has claimed that Mersel came to Chicago at the behest of Julius Rosenwald. You may know that name. He, of course, was the head of the behemoth Sears Roebuck Company at the time, big name in the development of Chicago in the early 20th century. So the timing and the idea was supposedly that Mersel was coming over. Rosenwald is developing the Museum of Science and Industry, and Mersel is coming over to do murals for that museum. Now the timing kind of works. So Rosenwald's work on the MSI does coincide with Mersel's immigration date, and Rosenwald had visited Munich in 1911. So it's plausible that he could have gotten to know Mersel's work while he was there. However, Mark Alvey, a Mersel researcher and staff member at the Field Museum of Chicago, has found no evidence of any contact between Rosenwald and Mersel. There's no mention of Mersel in Rosenwald's collected papers at the University of Chicago. And in the Abendpost interview, Mersel himself doesn't name a possible commission at the Museum of Science and Industry as a reason for coming to Chicago. So his reason for choosing Chicago remains uncertain, but what is certain is he contributed no murals to the Museum of Science and Industry. However, he did quickly land some commissions for decorative work of the type he had done in Europe. His most impactful work, see if I can move it. There we go. His most impactful work would have been for the Paradise Theater, the preposterously grand Balaban and Katz movie palace in Garfield Park. And Mersel did the proscenium painting, which was featured at the opening of the movies that they were showing, with a light show and everything. It must have been quite dramatic for the visitors in this really grand lobby. He did the murals kind of between the columns and things like that there. It must have been really a spectacle. I wish I had color pictures available of it, and I just haven't found any. Other commissioned architectural decorative work in Chicago included a restaurant ceiling for a Stop and Shop Grocery, of all things, the lobby ceiling of the new Hotel Jefferson. And notably, the architects for these three Chicago projects were all European immigrants, like Merzel. One was an Austro-Hungarian, one a Bavarian, one a Thuringian. So it seems that Merzel was maybe taking advantage of his European portfolio and building a new business network in Chicago. But unfortunately, Merzel did not find the spirit of cooperation between artist and architect that he had enjoyed in Germany. In a 1935 Chicago Daily News profile of Merzel by art critic C.J. Bullitt, the artist lamented the stark divide between the architect and the muralist in the United States. In Merzel's view, the painted mural is a vital factor in architectural design, and the architect should not hesitate to, quote, pay deference to the muralist to the extent even of altering his design. Merzel explained that in Germany, quote, the design of the building grows out of the combined talents of building and decorator. However, in the United States, he had found that, quote, the architect completes his plans and even delivers the finished building before the muralist is called in to adorn certain spaces. The work of the painter then is merely decorative, in no sense vital to the design. He must do the best he can with what is already accomplished. So Merzel's views, as I read this, I think immediately of Walter Gropius, the intellectual founder of the Bauhaus School of Art and Design. If you've paid any attention to that, you might recognize a little bit, and it's actually worth mentioning too, that the Bauhaus School kind of reconstitutes in a way in Chicago, just a couple of years after that interview that Merzel had with Bullitt. But in Gropius's manifesto, kind of launching the aims and purposes of the Bauhaus, right? He says, das Endziel aller bildnerischen Tätigkeit ist der Bau, right? So that the ultimate goal of all artistic activity is the building. To embellish buildings was once the noblest function of the fine arts. They were the indispensable components of great architecture. Today, the arts exist in isolation, from which they can be rescued only through the conscious cooperative effort of all craftsmen. Architects, painters, and sculptors must recognize anew and learn to grasp the composite character of a building, both as an entity and in its separate parts. Only then will their work be imbued with the architectonic spirit which it has lost as salon art. One can imagine Merzel affirming these statements with a hearty jawohl. And he would have nodded at the assertion that when it comes to art and design, form follows function, as the famous Bauhaus maxim goes. However, even if Gropius and Merzel were using the same words, they were speaking different languages. For Merzel, decorative art is indeed integral to the function of a building. His murals in theaters, concert halls, churches, public spaces, all were designed to enhance and elevate the user experience. But the types of buildings he decorated and the subject matter that he preferred, mythological themes, natural scenes, biblical imagery, were all associated with the neoclassical and neo-romantic tendencies of pre-modern art and architecture. This meant that by the late 1920s, Merzel's approach to art was becoming anachronistic. Quote, when I came in touch with American life, I encountered such big obstacles, ready-made opinions, and low-grade but successful competition that I quit almost entirely in a decorative business, said Merzel. So he was 58 years old when the stock market crashed in October 1929, and that wiped him out financially. The onset of the Great Depression erased the already limited opportunities that he had had for decorative commissions, and Merzel needed somehow to reinvent himself. And at an age when this is not so easily done. To make ends meet, he turned to easel painting. Prior to immigrating from Germany, Merzel was a 100% mural painter, as he had described himself to Bullitt. I disliked to paint pictures in oil and frames, he said, and claimed to have painted no more than about a dozen easel paintings in his life. It's not surprising, given the nature of the kind of work that he had done. You know, he believed that the best purpose for art was not merely to embellish a building, but to be an actual part of its design. to integrate with the space and even enhance it. A painted picture in a frame is something separate, unintegrated, even fungible. It just was not an art form that he valued. But now, out of necessity, he embraced painting canvases, hoping to tap into a different art market. With the zeal of a convert, Merzel began producing large numbers of canvases. At first, I started to paint decorative things on huge canvases, he said. When I had about 250 linear feet of such paintings, I stopped and began hesitatingly to paint pictures in frames. Soon, I began to get a real kick out of it. And now I am a convinced painter of pictures. By the 1930s, his easel paintings were being exhibited regularly in Chicago galleries. And indeed, the 1930s kind of became a major second heyday for Merzel. Certainly less in comparison to the reputation he had built for himself as a younger man in Germany between 1900 and 1914, but not bad for a man at this point now into his 60s and having to go into a completely different artistic direction. In fact, perhaps because he had been freed from the need to match his subject matter and style to a specific architectural setting, Merzel let his imagination run free. His easel paintings were remarkably diverse in subject matter and style. He painted lots of exotic birds and animals, kind of reminiscent of Babenhausen. A couple of these even ended up, let me see if I can find it here. Oh no, what did I do? There we go. A couple of these even ended up as covers for the Saturday Evening Post. So these are Merzel paintings. Who knows? You might have seen these somewhere floating around in the past. Some of his paintings drew from his muralist training in Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Hindu, Chinese, Baroque, Japanese, and Gothic aesthetics. And he often employed old material, mythological themes, biblical tropes, nature scenes. Many of his paintings can be categorized as surrealist. Others are reminiscent of the weirdest medieval fantasies of artists like Hieronymus Bosch. So I'll just kind of click through some examples of his work. You know, here are some of these typical kind of bird scenes, nature scenes that he produced for a certain kind of art consumer. He did landscapes. This one in the middle we'll see in a later slide. It was an award winner. And he really loved exploring just the weird and the grotesque. This is sort of the Bosch-like stuff here, right? So this is his triptych that he called Symphony in Hell. Yeah, his dream allegory, his wild hunter, his Saint Anthony. You know, I look at a Bosch painting sometimes, you know, and I think, what in the world were they all thinking back then? What were they on? And, you know, you look at Merzel and you kind of think the same thing. And remember his age here, right? So, you know, it's kind of cool that he's letting it just sort of fly. He had at least 60 public exhibitions of his work between 1932 and 1957. A couple of examples of invitations here. 19 of those that we know of were one-man shows. The rest were 2- and 3-man shows with other artists or as part of group exhibitions. Merzel belonged only loosely to any particular art group. He did exhibit with a group that called themselves the Neoterics. Their stated purpose was, quote, to keep intact their integrity as individualists, to observe with their own eyes, to record what they see without bowing to any isms or seeking favor through any art politics. So I think their purpose was, let's all be different together. So you know, there wasn't any real unifying principle for anything that they did. Merzel's relationship with this art critic, C.J. Bullitt, through this period is particularly revealing. And Bullitt is just an interesting person in his own right. He was born in 1883 and grew up in Corydon, Indiana, graduated from Indiana University in 1904, and then pursued a journalism career in Indianapolis for 9 years, before then, sometime in the 19-teens, moving to Chicago, where he began covering art for the Chicago Evening Post. The Post would eventually merge with the Chicago Daily News, but Bullitt stayed on, and over the next decades would establish himself as Chicago's foremost art critic. And that's a pretty neat accomplishment for someone who had absolutely no training in art or art history or aesthetics, right? He just went in and said, I'm the guy, and he made it happen. And so I'm pronouncing his name Bullet. His family actually spells his name B-U-L-L-E-I-T. He inverted those. So some people pronounce his name Bouillet, some Bouillet. I say Bullet because this family still exists. So if you've ever heard of Bullet Bourbon, that's that family. Yeah, so same group of people. So once in Chicago, Mercer was keen to win Bullitt's consideration and approval. Bullitt's archives in the Smithsonian Institution contain a number of letters from Mercer calling attention to his exhibitions and inviting his critical assessment, and one presumes hoping for favorable write-ups in the Chicago Daily News. Well, it worked. Bullitt became a major advocate for Mercer's work, as did his counterpart and competitor at the Chicago Tribune, Eleanor Jewett. Now, Bullitt and Jewett had completely different art values, and they seldom agreed on anything, but both found something to like about Mercer. Jewett declared that Mercer, quote, must be ranked as one of our outstanding painters, but Bullitt would always go much further with his praise. He wrote one review from which I've taken the title of my talk here. So Mercer, Morbid and Grim. This would have been in the mid-30s that he wrote this review. And he says, if the German-born Julius Mercer were in Paris instead of Chicago, he would be rated among the surrealists. He might kick and raise a racket, for he resents modernism and all its works, but that wouldn't do any good. The Parisians would point to his pictures like those hanging at the Findlay galleries, shrug their shoulders and say, voila. However, to give Mercer a loophole, there were surrealists before André Breton, Juan Miro, Giorgio de Chirico, and their lord and master Sigmund Freud even had grandfathers. Surrealism starts with the childhood of the race, when nightmares were rated as even more important than daydreams. To go back to no farther than a century or so, there was the surrealist William Blake in England, and after him in France came Gustave Moreau and Odilon Redon. So if Mercer doesn't like the isms of current manufacture, he may not object to being thought of in the tradition of Blake, Moreau, Redon, and contemporary counterparts of them in his native Germany. Bullitt goes on to describe in graphic, gruesome detail some of the works that were on display at the Findlay galleries, and he concludes with the assessment, morbid art, but as fascinating as the tales of Poe and as well done. Bullitt never wavered in his support for Mercer. In a 1947 article, he sought to steer Chicago art patrons away from a high-profile exhibit of major European surrealists and toward a one-man show by Mercer just down the street. He wrote, while hundreds of the sophisticated and the idly curious are flocking to the American Art Association galleries to look at the 11 paintings by major and minor surrealists, there are being displayed a few blocks down Michigan Avenue, a group of religious paintings by an aging Chicago painter that eclipses them all. The painter is Julius Mercer, by far the ablest decorative artist Chicago has ever produced. And Max Ernst and Salvador Dali might profitably sit at his feet for many hours to learn the secret of the awe and wonder he puts into his works.
Wow.
I wonder what he paid for those reviews, right? I mean, my gosh, we'd all love to get press like that. Mercer got a huge break in 1938 when he won the kind of large-scale decorative commission that he had been pursuing in vain since 1929. With support from the Works Progress Administration, Mercer was commissioned to create a series of murals on canvas for the world-class Field Museum of Natural History. The project was to consist of 13 paintings, but grew over time to 18, destined for the Hall of Food Plants and designed to illustrate the human activities which grow out of man's use of plants for food, as the WPA annual report put it. Mercer was 66 years old when he started work on this project in April 1938. By fall of 1939, he had completed 14 murals, laboring over each for a month on average and investing extensive research in the museum's botanical and ethnographic collections. When the entire series was unveiled in 1940, the director of the WPA in Chicago declared that they were a high watermark in WPA art achievement. Predictably, Bullitt and Jewett were also impressed, with the latter calling the murals one of those must shows, those imperative not to be missed affairs of which each season grants but a few. So I can show you how they are. And if you've been to the Field Museum, wandered through the Hall of Botany, you know, which isn't now today the high profile things that people go to see in the Field Museum, these murals all hang. And I forgot to include a picture of how they hang in context there. So there's Schaukasten, showcases displays of, you know, botany and different kinds of things. And then in the hall above hanging are these series of murals. So they're hanging above you and they're really large format things. And I think what's genius about it, what Merzel has done here, you know, it's about plants, but look for the plants, right? I mean, it's really about people and how people use the plants. You know, I mean, for example, the, see on this one, yeah, well, the top left, those are French coffee buyers in Yemen, right? So the plant is coffee. It's barely featured here, right? You can see some beans. To the right of that, those are people making olive oil. And so you can see the olive sort of, but again, it's more about the human processes, the anthropological content overpowers the botanical content, which was part of the point of the exhibit, right? It's about how humans make use of plants. But I see a certain genius in this for something that's kind of utilitarian, you know, a way of just telling a museum story, but you can tell Merzel took it sort of next level. I want to include all 18 here. So here are 8 then. So here's 4 additional ones. You know, even urban landscapes here. You know, how does food even come to a market? How do urban people get their food, right? How do they access plants? So it's a pretty neat thing, and it still hangs there today. So, you know, the Field Museum gets, you know, I mean, pre-COVID, about 1.5 million visitors a year. I don't know if they've rebounded entirely yet. But how many of those 1.5 million or plus wander through these halls? They see Merzel's work for sure. Do they ever make a connection? I doubt it. How many theater goers in Stuttgart look up at that ceiling and know who did it, right? So he's right in front of us. All right. This would be the last transcendent success that Merzel could claim. He continued to paint through the 1940s and 50s. And of course, chances to exhibit during the World War II years were few, as one might expect. And the art world seems to mostly have moved on from Merzel in the post-war era. He still had a few exhibitions through the 1940s and into the 1950s, but he found it increasingly difficult to be recognized, as a couple of letters to Bullitt show. And the one on the left, I'm not sure you can see it, he's complaining again about the Art Institute of Chicago. He had a running feud with the Art Institute. And some people think that really hurt him, right? He was prickly, you know, he didn't like the way they did business. They didn't like him. And you can imagine the Art Institute makes reputations to some degree. So he's complaining about them to Bullitt. And then the other one, he's just saying, I can't get exhibits, you know, they don't want my paintings because I don't make stuff that sells, right? You know, who's gonna buy my weird fantasies, right? In one of them about his triptych of hell, he asked Bullitt, he's like, won't you please tell what's wrong with my hell, right? And he was wondering why people wouldn't purchase these things. So his sales dwindled, and his last years were said to be difficult by those who knew him. He died in 1957 at the age of 85, reportedly broke, and he seems to have been quickly forgotten by an art-consuming public that had different interests in the 1960s and beyond. So to return to the question at the beginning of my talk, what happened to Merzel's fame and his reputation? How is it that this remarkably successful artist who found audiences in both Germany and in the United States is largely unknown today? Well, I mentioned Mark Alvey at the Field Museum. I think he's compiled the best speculation for why Merzel today is not as well known as some of his peers. Alvey believes that the key reason is that despite exhibiting frequently over 3 decades, Merzel simply did not sell that many paintings, or at least not enough paintings to the people who counted in the art world. His works were not acquired in big numbers by influential collectors and museums, and his strong critical reputation didn't translate into commercial success. It also matters that he was a Chicago artist. The wealthy collectors and institutions that shaped the Chicago art market looked to Paris and New York rather than in their own backyard, as if the mere fact that an artist were based in Chicago was some evidence of secondary status. Another important factor is the timing of his move to the United States on the eve of the Great Depression. Right? Although he won critical acclaim with his canvases in the 1930s, private buyers were few, art sales were tepid at best, and museums cut back dramatically on their acquisitions through that time. By the time the art market rebounded in the post-World War II era, his style was out of fashion. He belonged to no real school or trend. One can make a small claim for surrealism, but he really was defined by his eclecticism, right? I mean, he just did a little bit of everything. He didn't belong to the major trends of the 40s and then into the 50s, regionalism and abstract expressionism, which came to dominate the market. He was attached to neither group. So in a way, his diversity and his ability to execute the widest range of styles actually worked against him. So to Alvey's reasons, I would add two more. Mersel's greatest achievements were his numerous large-scale mural works in Germany, many of which, as we've learned, were destroyed during World War II, or in the intervening almost 100 years at that time, had been painted over during renovations. None of his fresco work in Chicago survives. The Paradise Theater, the grocery restaurant have been demolished. The hotel ceiling has been repainted, renovated. And so by rejecting the portable medium of the canvas in favor of the seemingly more permanent medium of architectural decoration, Mersel actually inadvertently created art that was ephemeral. And a final factor was just cost. Original paintings by serious artists are expensive in any era, and Mersel's were no exception. For example, the list price for in this painting from 1937, I'm sorry, I only have a black and white photograph from Bullitt's archives. It's called The First Reliable Self-Portrait. And if you can get the joke there as he's kind of lying in a meadow with his lederhosen on, looking down. The list price for this painting was $600 in 1937. That's the equivalent of $12,800 today. That's mid-priced for Mersel, based on the few available price sheets that I've been able to find. His most expensive paintings were listed at $2,500, which is $60,000 today, while his least expensive works could have been had for $200. That's about $4,500 today. So these prices are, of course, not at all out of line for successful established artists, but are for sure at a price point that only select consumers of art could afford. In 1937, the national average for annual income was less than $2,000 a year. A new house was around $4,000. A new car could be had for less than $800. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of, who can buy art like this, right? I buy a lot of art. I don't buy art at that price point, right? And remember, this is also a time of extreme economic uncertainty in the United States. So he had for sure an admiring public, but who was buying his paintings? And then, so I'll just leave it at that. But so he did make enough or sell enough paintings to make a decent living, at least until the last few years of his life. And yet outside of those private holdings, he's barely represented in museums today. We know, for example, that there are none in the Michigan City Library in Indiana, right? In his adopted city of Chicago, only the 18 murals at the Field Museum are on public display. His prize-winning painting Springtime was acquired and hangs at the Union League Club, which says that it's the second largest private art collection in the Midwest behind the Art Institute of Chicago. You can go see this, you have to pay to go through. 8 of his paintings are held by the Münchner Stadtmuseum, and it includes this really excellent portrait of him by his good friend Louis Grell, also a Chicago artist. That's Louis Grell posing next to his portrait of Mersel. The Illinois State Museum has some Mersel paintings, as does the Braithwaite Gallery at the Southern Utah University, and drum roll please, 8 of his paintings hang in academic buildings at my alma mater and my place of work, Wabash College in Crawfordsville, Indiana. So this then explains why I know who Merzel is when almost no one else does. And it also explains why my students are aware of his contributions, to the Jagdschloss at Babenhausen. So hanging just outside my former office in the Modern Languages Department at Wabash is this painting. Does anybody recognize the subject matter? Wer reitet so spät durch Nacht und Wind? So this is Merzel's depiction of Goethe's famous poem Erlkönig. And this is a poem which we teach each year in intermediate German. So I used this painting as a teaching aid for years before I thought to ask myself, who did this painting, right? And so I checked with our archivist. It had no inventory number. It wasn't tracked in our catalog anywhere. And so I got curious about who he was and did some internet searching, kind of figuring out what the signature is, and came up with Merzel, and it hit. So that same internet sleuthing led me to a 1999 article by Mark Alvey at the Field Museum, who had done some work on those murals that hang in the Hall of Botany there. And so I reached out to Mark. He did a little digging, and in short order, he figured out what the connection was to Wabash College. So one of Merzel's most important patrons in his late decades was a woman named Ruth Thomas, Thomys. And when Merzel died, his widow, who was a good friend of Ruth, gave her about a third of his unsold paintings. Ruth's maiden name was Planitz, and her brother was Karl-Heinz Planitz, who taught German at Wabash from 1957 to 1979. So Karl-Heinz selected several paintings from the trove that his sister had inherited. Of course, I'm glad he chose that Erlkönig. It's awesome, I think. And he later gifted those paintings to Wabash College. We actually should have 9. But the whereabouts of one, a depiction of Orpheus playing the lyre, has been missing since 1999. So kind of shades of the Michigan City Library again, and quite embarrassing in my view. The other works include this representation, the one on your left of the Sermon on the Mount. And he's executed this a couple of times. I like ours better. It's kind of a modernist work. If you look at it closely, and it's wonky because it hangs high and awkwardly in a stairwell. I haven't taken it down yet to get a better picture. But you can see that hardly anyone's paying attention, right? They're all kind of turned away. And that's kind of a modernist interpretation, I think, of the Sermon on the Mount. And then we also have 6 large map murals showing the development of civilization, right? So these are large format things. They're about 4 feet by 5 feet, 4 feet by 6 feet. And they show kind of the development of civilization. You can see a little bit from the banners, what they represent. And then along with those panels is a hand-lettered sign that describes the paintings as follows. The 6 oil paintings in this room were painted by Julius Merzel, a well-known artist in both Germany and the United States in the early 20th century. In the 1930s, after moving to America, Merzel was commissioned to paint the very large mural paintings for Hall 25, The Development of Man, in the Field Museum of Chicago. They are fanciful representation of parts of biblical lands and the New World. Sometime later, Merzel painted these small replicas, and Professor Karl-Heinz Planitz of the Department of German presented them to Wabash College in 1961. So says the little sign. So now the fun begins for me, because the information on that sign is almost certainly wrong. And neither Mark Alvey nor I can find any evidence, none at all, that there was ever such a commission for the development of man at the Field Museum. He has found that Hall 25 back then is the Hall of Botany, right? It's what it is today, right? So we think that these paintings are just clearly studies. They're pitches that he's making, proposals to the Field Museum or others to try to get them to hire him to do the work. If they were copies, actually, they wouldn't have the errors that we find in these. If you look at them closely, there are paint overs where, oh, I don't like having Arabia here. I'm going to move it over here. So it kind of halfway paints over it, and you can still see the original thing. They're studies. And I think another way I can confirm this is I found in Bullitt's archives this listing of Merzel murals and paintings, and they're here. and they're listed as copyrighted. So I think the things that are copyrighted on this list were things he was sending out, looking for commissions, but he's protecting the images with his own copyright. So there's all kinds of fun to still do on people like this and to track things down. I mean, where's that painting of Orpheus playing the lyre? Is it in some hidden corner at Wabash College? I'm going to keep looking. I think there's all kinds of fun things still to discover about artists like this, for whom there's some work has been done, but he's largely overlooked. So I'm going to continue to dig and to research the interesting character that is Julius Merzel. And in the meantime, I'll enjoy his Erlkönig every time I walk past it and his Sermon on the Mount while I'm at work. So thank you. Time for questions, about run long. Just a couple minutes.
Yeah, we have a couple minutes for a few questions.
Yeah, so I knew that was going to be long. Sorry.
Start with Bill.
Please. So the language department is it's called Detchend International Hall. And if you come in and go upstairs, or outside my door, there's a little tower, right? And I had my own ivory tower back in the day, right? So it hangs just outside there, the hallway. And then the other one is Center Hall, which is our administrative building for the most part, and it hangs in the north stairwell of that. And then the map paintings are in a classroom at the south end of that building on the second floor. And I didn't even know they were there, right? I mean, I'd lived most of my life at Wabash over in modern languages. And of course, I knew the Erlkönig painting. And then when I moved into the dean's office, I was having a group meeting with some students in a classroom that I'd never taught in. And I looked and I was like, oh my gosh, these are Merzel paintings, right? So, and then the Sermon on the Mount, I didn't even know it was there until about a month ago. I'd walked past it, of course, 100 times or more. I just had never made the connection, but I'd gotten the archives from Bullitt, from the Smithsonian, and scrolling through there's a picture of that painting in Bullitt's archives that had been submitted. That's a black and white photograph, probably for printing in the newspaper. And then as soon as I saw, it was like light, it was like blitz, I mean, I almost fell down. Oh my gosh. So kind of cool. Yeah.
Are there any of his paintings that have Bullitt's
distillery? I have no idea. Yeah, no clue. But it's kind of creepy. I was working on this paper yesterday, and then this morning on Facebook, I had an ad for Bullitt bourbon. They're always listening. So yeah, I need to go down there and see. I doubt it, but it's possible. I don't know if Bullitt ended up with some of his works, right? He was such a fan. It seems likely that he did. Yeah, please, Bill.
In order to find that missing painting from the Wabash collection, have you ever thought about getting a warrant and searching all those fraternity houses?
Oh, I have been through every one of those fraternity houses, looking for other things that I think. I'm not found. Yeah,
I have a comment. I find it very interesting that the Saturday Evening Post featured some of his paintings because Norman Rockwell owns the Saturday Evening Post.
Right.
And his artwork is photographic almost.
Yes.
That they took his and presented that. Were they in the same time period?
Yeah, they would have been, yeah, for sure. And in fact, so Ali is another thing. He speculates that kind of work actually hurts Merzel's reputation, right? That makes him an illustrator rather than an artist. But people have been slow to appreciate people like Norman Rockwell as an actual serious artist, as a commentator on American life, which he is, right? Yeah. But that's been a hard-won, very slow reputation for Rockwell. Maybe Merzel will get there eventually.
I find it very interesting.
Yeah, it is. Those are the only three that I know of that he did.
The Gruel gentleman that's beside the portrait, is that in the same time period as James Whitcomb Riley? Because Gruel illustrated James Whitcomb Riley's.
Yeah, so Riley is what? He's more late 19th, early 20th Does that
Died
sound
in
right?
1916.
Yeah, okay. So this was later. So Mercer and Gruel were contemporaries. So this isn't Johnny Gruel, not Johnny Gruel.
Okay.
This is Louis Gruel. He's a different guy entirely.
Okay.
Yeah, and he was a very popular artist in Chicago at the same time. Probably has a little bit of a better reputation today, a sustained reputation, because there's a Gruel Foundation, and it's led by a son or grandson, and they work to kind of keep his name out there. And Mercer has no such person.
You can be that.
I guess that's good. All right, thanks everyone.